She had learned, a long time ago, how to be invisible. It was not a skill anyone had taught her directly, not a lesson written in a book or passed down with kindness, but rather something Sarah Voss had absorbed through years of being overlooked, talked over, stepped around, and forgotten. She had perfected the art of taking up as little space as possible, of keeping her eyes down and her voice soft, of finding the corner of every room and pressing herself into it so thoroughly that people would leave and genuinely not remember she had been there at all. It was a survival technique. In Thornvale Pack, where status was everything and she had none, invisibility was the closest thing to safety she had ever found. She was 23 years old, and she had never shifted. She had never felt the pull of the moon the way the others described it, that wild magnetic surge that called the wolf forward from beneath the skin. There was no wolf inside her. Or if there was, it had been sleeping so long and so deeply that Sarah had stopped believing it would ever wake. The pack called her half-born, sometimes. The kinder ones simply said nothing at all, which was its own particular cruelty. She lived in the small room at the back of her Aunt Delia's house, a room that had once been used for storage, and still smelled faintly of old cedar and dust no matter how many times Sarah scrubbed the walls. She worked in the pack kitchen, preparing food for ceremonies and gatherings, and she was good at it, genuinely good, with steady hands and a sense for flavor that the head cook, Old Morris, occasionally praised in a gruff and embarrassed way that made her chest ache with something she refused to name as hope. That was her life, small and contained and survivable. Then the announcement came, and everything that was small and contained shattered like glass dropped on stone. King Caden of the Iron Throne was coming to Thornvale. The news spread through the pack the way fire spreads through dry grass, faster than anyone thought possible, consuming everything in its path. Sarah heard it first from the kitchen, where two of the serving girls were whispering with wide eyes and flushed cheeks, their vegetable chopping completely forgotten. She heard it again at the water tap, and then in the corridor outside Delia's sitting room, and then formally, in the announcement that Alpha Gregor read aloud in the great hall, with a chest puffed up so wide with self-importance that he looked like he might float away. King Caden, the Iron King, the most powerful alpha in the known world, ruler of 7 territories, a man whose name was spoken in the same breath as words like ruthless and ancient and absolute. He was coming for the sacred claiming ceremony, the ritual held once every decade at Thornvale because of the claiming stone housed in the old temple at the center of the pack's territory, the stone that had chosen mates for the royal bloodline for as long as anyone could remember. Every unmated female in Thornvale between the ages of 18 and 30 was required to present herself before the stone. It was law. It was tradition. It was, for most of the women in the pack, the event of a lifetime. For Sarah Voss, it was a fresh new nightmare. "You are not seriously worried," her cousin Vivien said that evening, appearing in the doorway of Sarah's small room without knocking, as she always did, as if the concept of boundaries did not apply between them. Vivien was beautiful in the way that certain flowers are beautiful, all vivid color and perfect symmetry, with none of the softness that makes beauty approachable. She had her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's cold gray eyes, and she had inherited from both of them a talent for cruelty so refined it barely looked like cruelty at all. She was also the strongest female wolf in Thornvale's younger generation, fast and fierce and politically connected, and she had been telling anyone who would listen, for the past 3 years, that she intended to be queen. She leaned against the doorframe now and looked at Sarah with that particular expression she had, the one that managed to combine amusement and contempt so perfectly you could not always tell where one ended and the other began. "You do not even have a wolf. The stone will not react to you at all. You will just stand there and look pathetic, which honestly is what you do everywhere else, so I suppose it will be consistent." She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "Do not embarrass the family, Sarah. That is all I ask." Sarah did not respond. She had learned, also a long time ago, that responding to Vivien only ever made things worse. She waited until the sound of heels on hardwood faded down the corridor, and then she sat down on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed slowly through her nose and told herself what she always told herself in the aftermath of Vivien's attentions. It does not matter. It will pass. You are still here. She believed it mostly. The problem was that this time, she was not sure how to be invisible enough. The claiming ceremony required her physical presence. Alpha Gregor had been very specific. Every unmated female. No exceptions. She was going to have to stand in front of the most powerful man alive, in front of her entire pack, and offer herself to a stone that everyone knew would look right through her. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The preparations for the king's arrival consumed Thornvale like a second fever on top of the first. The great hall was cleaned and recleaned and decorated with deep crimson banners bearing the Iron Throne's emblem, a wolf's head above a crown of twisted iron, the symbol that every wolf child in every territory knew from the time they were old enough to understand what power meant. Extra food was ordered, extra staff brought in from neighboring settlements, and the old temple at the center of the territory was opened and aired for the first time in a decade, the claiming stone at its heart uncovered and polished by 3 of the pack's eldest women who wore ceremonial gloves and spoke in quiet voices, and looked, Sarah thought, when she glimpsed them through the temple's open doors, genuinely awed. She had never seen the stone up close. She had been 12 the last time the ceremony was held, and she had been kept away from it by some excuse or another that she could no longer remember, only that she had watched from a hillside as the older girls walked down toward the temple in their best dresses, and she had felt, even then, that she was not part of the story being told. That had been 10 years ago. Now she was required to stand in that temple, and she felt no more prepared than she had at 12. King Caden arrived on a Thursday morning, with an escort of 20 warriors, so disciplined and so quietly menacing that the village dogs stopped barking and the children stopped running, and the entire visible population of Thornvale seemed to hold its breath at once. Sarah was in the kitchen when he rode through the main gate, but she heard the change in the air, that particular drop in ambient sound that happens when something shifts irrevocably, when the world registers the presence of something genuinely extraordinary. She wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped to the small kitchen window and looked out, and she saw him. Just for a moment. Just enough to form an impression that she spent the rest of the day trying unsuccessfully to set aside. He was not what she had imagined, which was a certain kind of obvious, powerful largeness, an alpha performing his own dominance the way Alpha Gregor did, loud and expansive and always aware of the audience. Caden was not performing anything. He rode through the gate the way a stone drops through water, with simple, uncomplicated gravity, and the space around him rearranged itself accordingly. He was tall and dark-haired, with a face that was all clean angles and the kind of controlled expression that gave nothing away for free. He turned his head once as he passed the kitchen window, a slight movement, almost automatic, like a sensor sweeping for threats, and for one fraction of a second his eyes seemed to pass directly over her position. She knew he could not have seen her through the small dusty glass. She stepped back anyway. The night before the claiming ceremony, Sarah could not sleep. She lay in her cedar-smelling room and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, and the distant murmur of wolves still awake in celebration. And she thought about the stone. The elders said it was sentient, in the way that very old and very powerful things sometimes became sentient, not thinking the way a person thinks, but aware, resonant, attuned to bloodlines and bonds and the deep currents of supernatural heritage that ran through the wolf world like underground rivers. It would react to a true mate, a true bloodline connection, in ways that could not be faked or manufactured. A warm light, the stories said, for a worthy mate, a blazing light, for something rarer, and nothing, no light at all, for those whose blood carried no connection to the royal line. She knew which of those she was. She had always known. She just had to survive the ceremony with whatever dignity she could scrape. Together, and then she could disappear again, and it would be over, and she could go back to her kitchen and her small room and her small life, and be grateful for it. She fell asleep just before dawn and dreamed of fire. The claiming ceremony was held at dusk in the old temple, with the pack gathered in the rows of stone seats that curved around the central chamber like the inside of a cupped hand. The claiming stone stood at the chamber's heart on a raised dais, roughly the size and shape of a large desk, its surface smooth and dark as still water, shot through with veins of pale silver that caught the torchlight and held it. King Caden sat on a ceremonial chair to the stone's right, elevated slightly, watching. He had not changed expression since she had glimpsed him arriving, or if he had, she had not been present for it. He watched the proceedings with the same controlled attention he seemed to bring to everything, noting, processing, revealing nothing. Beside him sat his second, a broad-shouldered man named Rowan, who occasionally leaned in to murmur something in the king's ear and received in return the briefest of nods. Alpha Gregor stood near the entrance, beaming, gesturing the young women forward one by one, performing his own importance for the assembled pack with the dedication of a man who understood that this ceremony was the most significant thing to happen in his territory in a decade and intended to extract every possible unit of prestige from it. The women went to the stone in order of rank, which meant Vivien went near the beginning. She walked to the dais in a dress the color of midnight, her silver blonde hair pinned in an elaborate arrangement that had taken 3 women 2 hours to achieve, and she placed her hands on the stone with the confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of failure. The stone glowed, a warm, steady golden light that spread from beneath her palms and made the watching pack murmur appreciatively. It was a good result. It was not, Sarah noticed from her seat at the very back of the chamber, the blazing light of the stories, the extraordinary light that meant something rarer than a worthy mate. Vivien seemed to register this too, a flicker of something moving across her perfect face before she schooled it back to gracious composure and stepped away from the stone. The king had watched her approach and departure with the same expression he had given everyone else. Nothing changed in his face. Nothing shifted. Vivien's eyes cut to him, and away again so quickly it might have been imagined. But Sarah, who had been watching Vivien her entire life, did not imagine it. The women continued. The stone gave its warm gold light to some and a faint, non-committal shimmer to others, and nothing at all to a few, who walked back to their seats with carefully arranged expressions that broke Sarah's heart a little, even as she sat dreading her own turn. She was the last. She was always last, placed there by the protocol that put unranked, non-shifting females at the very end of the ceremony. A slot that read as a formality, as an afterthought, as the pack's obligatory acknowledgement that yes, technically she was there. Technically, she was female and unmated. Technically, the law applied to her too. She was aware of the ripple of attention that went through the chamber as her name was called, not the attentive interest they had given the higher-ranked women, but the sideways, uncomfortable awareness of a crowd watching something they half expected to be embarrassing. She heard a soft, quickly suppressed laugh from somewhere to her left. She kept her eyes forward and walked to the dais. She was almost at the stone when Vivien's voice came from behind her, clear and carrying and perfectly pitched for the chamber's acoustics. "Poor thing," Vivien said, in the tone of someone performing sympathy while actually performing something else entirely. "Perhaps if we all close our eyes, it will be less awkward when nothing happens." Another laugh, this one less suppressed. Alpha Gregor said nothing. King Caden's eyes moved to Vivien, and then back to Sarah. and still his expression did not change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted, though she could not have said precisely how. She reached the stone. She placed her hands on its surface. The stone was cool beneath her palms, smooth as glass, and she felt nothing, which was exactly what she had expected, and she was already composing the expression she would wear when she stepped away, the one that said, "This does not matter. This does not touch me. I am already somewhere else in my mind." The stone exploded with light, not the warm gold of a worthy mate, not the faint shimmer of a distant connection. The stone beneath her hands erupted with a white light so intense that the people nearest the dais flinched back and raised their arms to shield their eyes, and the silver veins in. Its surface blazed like rivers of lightning, and the light spread up her arms and around her hands and climbed toward her elbows with a heat that was not burning, but was something beyond warmth, something that felt like being recognized after a very long time of being unknown. Sarah stood frozen. Her hands were shaking. She could feel something inside her shifting, not painfully, but with the irresistible momentum of a tide that had been held back for a very long time, and was finally moving. Somewhere deep in her chest, something that had been sleeping began to stir. From behind her came the sound of the pack reacting, voices rising in shock and confusion, and something that was edging toward reverence. And she heard the sharp intake of breath from the eldest of the ceremonial women, and she heard that woman say, in a voice that shook with something between terror and awe, "The first blood mark. Moon and earth. It is the first blood mark. It has not been seen in 4 centuries." She heard a chair scrape stone. She turned. King Caden was standing. He was looking at her the way she had never been looked at before in her life, with the full weight of his attention. All of it, undivided and absolute, as if the rest of the chamber had ceased to exist for him, as if every calculation and strategy and year of searching had converged on this single point in space and time, and the woman standing in the blazing light of the claiming stone. His expression had finally changed. She could not fully read what was in it. There was recognition there, unmistakably, and something fiercer beneath that, and beneath that, something that she was not ready to name, and was fairly certain he was not ready to name either, because he was a man who had, clearly, never been caught off guard in his life, and he was caught off guard now, and the knowledge of it was moving across his face in real time like weather. "What is your name?" he said. It was not a question exactly. It had the quality of something being stated, something being claimed, even in its form as a question. She met his eyes. She did not look away. "Sarah Voss," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for that small mercy. He stepped down from the dais. The pack parted for him without being asked, instinctively, as water parts for a stone, and he walked toward her through the blazing light of the stone that was still pouring from her hands, still flooding the chamber, with that impossible white radiance, and he stopped 2 feet in front of her and looked at her as if he were taking inventory of something precious, as if he were memorizing something he was afraid might disappear. "Sarah Voss," he repeated quietly. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, that particular heat that powerful alphas carried. The excess energy of a wolf that had more power than one body was strictly designed to contain. "Do you know what this means?" "No," she said honestly. "Someone could explain it to me." Something moved in his face. She thought, distantly, that it might have been the beginning of a smile. "What do you think will happen next?" Leave your predictions in the comments below. The explanation came from the eldest woman, whose name was Marin, and whose hands had stopped shaking by the time she sat Sarah down in the antechamber of the temple, with a cup of something warm and bitter that was apparently traditional in situations of supernatural revelation. "The first blood mark," Marin said, was the sign of direct descent from the original Alpha line, the founding bloodline of the wolf world, the source from which all pack hierarchy and royal claims theoretically flowed. It had not manifested in 400 years because the original line had been believed extinct, wiped out in the territorial wars of the previous era, every member hunted and killed by rivals who understood what it meant for their own claims to power. The fact that it had manifested now, in a young woman who had no wolf, no status, no apparent supernatural ability of any kind, meant one of two things. Either the line had survived in secret, hidden in ordinary-seeming blood for generations, dormant and patient, and waiting, or the universe had done something extraordinary and unprecedented. Maren seemed to believe it was the former. She looked at Sarah with the expression of a woman reassembling a puzzle she had long since given up on, and was finding, to her profound shock, that the pieces fit. "Your parents," she said. "Do you know anything about your parents?" Sarah's parents had died when she was 4, in a territorial accident, or so she had been told. She had no memories of them worth speaking of, only sensory fragments. The smell of something like cedar and rain, the feeling of large, warm hands, a song she could not quite remember the words to. She had never questioned the story of the accident. She had never had reason to. She told Maren this, and watched something complicated cross the old woman's face, something that mixed grief and anger, and a dawning, terrible understanding. "There was no accident," Maren said very quietly, looking at the wall rather than at Sarah. "I am sorry. I believe there was no accident. I think someone knew what was in your blood before you did, and tried to make certain it never emerged." The warmth in Sarah's chest, that stirring thing, pulsed once. Hard, like a second heartbeat. King. Caden insisted she be moved to the main house immediately, out of the small storage room and into proper guest quarters with a guard posted outside the door, and Alpha Gregor agreed with an alacrity that made Sarah wonder, uncharitably, whether he was agreeing because he cared about her safety, or because he was unwilling to disagree with a king who had just watched his previously invisible ward light up an ancient stone like a signal fire. She suspected it was the latter. The quarters she was given were finer than anything she had inhabited in her entire life. A large room with proper furniture and soft lamps, and a window that looked out over the pack territory rather than the back wall of a garden shed. She sat in the middle of the bed and looked at her hands and tried to understand what had happened to her life in the space of 4 hours. Her hands looked the same as they always had. The light from the stone was gone from them, but she could still feel where it had been, like the warmth left in stone after the sun moves on, a residual heat that told her it would come back. That it was part of her, had always been part of her, had simply been waiting. There was a knock at the door. She called out for them to come in, expecting Maren, or one of the escort women who had been hovering since the ceremony with the anxious energy of people who are not sure what the protocol is for a situation no living person has encountered before. It was not Maren. King Caden stepped into the room alone, which she suspected was unusual for him based on the way he carried himself, with the specific self-awareness of a man who was accustomed to being watched. He closed the door behind him and looked at her across the room, and she looked back, and neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. He had changed from his ceremonial dress into something simpler, dark clothing, that made him look less like a symbol and more like a person. Though the authority was still there, still present, an invisible weight in the air around him that she was increasingly able to feel as something physical, a pressure against her skin. She was aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, that she was sitting in the middle of a bed, in a room with this man. She sat up straighter and put her feet on the floor. "I wanted to check on you," he said. There was a careful quality to it, as if he was not entirely certain how one checks on a person in this particular situation, and was proceeding with methodical caution. "This has been, I imagine, an overwhelming evening." "Mildly," she said. He looked at her. The beginning of that almost smile moved across his face again, there and gone. She told me about the first bloodline, Sarah continued. Marin. She told me what she thinks happened to my parents. He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, something that was not the controlled blankness he wore in public, but something more honest, a thread of something that looked like anger carefully contained. I know what she told you, he said, because I believe it is true. I have suspected for several years that the original line was not extinct, but hidden, and I have been looking for it. He crossed to the chair near the window and sat down in it, which somehow changed the energy of the room, made it less formally charged, more like a conversation. I was not looking for you specifically. I did not know it would be you. But when I came here tonight and the stone did what it did, I understood immediately that I had finally found what I was looking for. He paused. That sounds, he said, as if I am describing a search for an artifact rather than a person. I am aware that is not how I should be speaking about you. She looked at him, with something that was not quite surprise, and not quite suspicion, but lived in the territory between them. And how should you be speaking about me? She asked. I do not entirely know yet, he said, and he said it with enough honesty that something in her chest responded to it. A small, involuntary movement, as if whatever was waking up inside her recognized the honesty and leaned toward it. But I would like to find out. The night stretched long after he left. Sarah lay in the large, soft bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize her thoughts into something that made sense, and found that they refused to cooperate. The life she had known for, 23 years was not, apparently, the life she had actually been living. The parents she had been told died in an accident had not died in an accident. The powerlessness she had worn like a second skin, the absence of a wolf, the half-born label, none of it was the truth of her. It was a curtain, or perhaps a cage, and tonight the door had been opened by a piece of ancient stone that was not supposed to still know her name. And there was a king in the building who had just told her, with careful words and honest eyes, that he wanted to find out how to speak about her. She pressed her palms together in the dark and felt the residual warmth pulse between them and thought, with something that was cautious and fragile, and refusing to be killed. What if? Morning came with new complications, as mornings in dramatically altered circumstances tend to do. The first complication was Vivien, who arrived at Sarah's new room before breakfast, wearing an expression that had been assembled, with great care to resemble warmth and not quite managed it, like a painting of a fire that gives no heat. She embraced Sarah, which she had not done since they were small children, and the embrace had the stiff precision of a gesture being performed rather than felt. I am so happy for you, Vivien said, her voice pitched at a frequency that carried genuine warmth, and yet also, somehow, a specific kind of chill underneath. Truly, none of us had any idea. What a shock it must be. She released Sarah and held her at arm's length and looked at her with those cool gray eyes. And Sarah, who had 19 years of experience reading Vivien's expressions, understood in that moment that her cousin was afraid. Not of her, exactly. Of what she represented. Of what the stone's reaction meant for Vivien's own carefully cultivated plans. I appreciate that, Sarah said. She kept her voice neutral. There was a time, not so many years ago, when Vivien's sudden kindness would have undone her, would have made her reach back for it like a drowning person reaching for a rope, because kindness from Vivien was so rare and so hungered for. She was aware, sitting with this knowledge now, that this was one of the ways she had been kept small. The intermittent gift of attention from someone whose opinion should not have mattered so much, given precisely often enough to maintain the attachment, and then withdrawn precisely when withdrawal would hurt the most. She saw the mechanism clearly. Now, as if the light from the stone had illuminated it too. The second complication arrived at breakfast in the form of Lord Ashton Vile, the king's political advisor, and the second most powerful man in the Iron Throne's court, who had the eyes of a man performing calculations and the smile of a man who enjoyed what the calculations told him. He sat across from Sarah at the breakfast table and spoke with great smoothness about the historical significance of the first blood mark and the political implications of its emergence and the various protocols that the crown would need to observe and the various parties who would need to be informed. And Sarah listened and ate her eggs and understood that to Lord Vielle she was a situation to be managed, an asset to be deployed, a political development with legs. She did not like this. She also understood it well enough not to be naive about it. She was, suddenly, a person of enormous significance in a world that ran on significance. The question was what she intended to do about that. King Caden arrived at the table mid-breakfast, and his arrival reorganized the room the way his arrival had reorganized the courtyard, everything shifting slightly in relation to his gravitational presence. And he sat beside Sarah without ceremony, which was itself a statement, and looked at her plate, and then at her face and said quietly, for her ears only, "Did Vielle explain it properly? Or did he explain it as if you are a chess piece?" She looked at him. "Both, somewhat," she said. Something crossed his face that was definitely amusement this time, genuine and unguarded, and it changed his entire appearance, softened all those clean, controlled angles into something warmer, and she felt the warmth in her palms pulse in response and had to look away before he could see what the pulse had done to her expression. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Over the days that followed, Caden did not leave. She had assumed, she realized, that he would handle the political implications of the evening and depart, leaving his staff to manage whatever needed managing and returning to his actual responsibilities, which were presumably numerous and pressing. He did not. He remained in Thornvale, and he remained near her, with the specific and slightly unnerving attentiveness of a man who has found something he has been looking for and is disinclined to let it out of his sight. He asked her about her life, about the kitchen, about what she liked and what she had studied and what she thought about things, and he listened to her answers with the kind of focused attention that she was entirely unprepared for, having spent most of her life speaking to people who were waiting for her to finish so they could speak themselves. He was direct. He was also, she discovered gradually, funny, in a dry and precise way that caught her off guard when it appeared, and the surprise of it kept happening. The way turning a corner and finding something unexpected keeps happening, each time newly pleasant. She was not prepared to trust it. She knew that. She had worked out, with the clarity that comes from enforced solitude and a great deal of time to think, that trust was the thing Vivien had spent years undermining in her. Not just trust in other people, but trust in her own perceptions, trust in her own worth, trust in the idea that anyone who offered kindness was offering it genuinely. She told herself, when she felt something soften in her chest during a long conversation with Caden about pack governance theory, that this was chemistry and proximity and the extraordinary circumstances of the stone's revelation, and that chemistry and proximity were not the same as safety. She told herself this, and believed it, mostly. And then he stopped a formal political meeting mid-sentence, because he had noticed that she was standing in a doorway, hesitating whether to enter. And he stood up, and crossed the room and said, calmly, loudly enough for the room to hear, "Come in. You should be part of this conversation. You have the most relevant heritage in this room, and your perspective is not optional." And the thing in her chest did not soften so much as expand, suddenly and without warning, pressing against her ribcage from the inside. Morin had continued working with her quietly through all of this, in the early mornings before the day's formal demands began, sitting with her in the temple antechamber and teaching her what she knew about the first bloodline and its history and the powers that historically accompanied it. The powers were considerable. Heightened senses, but not the standard wolf ones. Something older and stranger. A kind of resonance with the emotional states of those around her that went beyond empathy into something almost oracular. the ability to speak to another wolf's own nature, to reach through the surface aggression or fear and find the animal underneath and address it directly. And the wolf itself, which Maren believed had not been absent but suppressed, held down by a combination of the shock of losing her parents young and, likely, something more deliberate, something that had been done to her. This last possibility made the controlled anger in Caden's expression deepen when Maren mentioned it to both of them, though he said nothing, and Sarah filed the depth of his reaction away in the part of her mind that was still doing cautious accounting. The suppression, Maren said, was breaking down on its own now. The stone had struck the first blow against it, and the presence of a mate bond would accelerate the process. She said the word mate the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, as if it were simply a piece of information rather than a grenade dropped into the middle of a room. Sarah saw Caden's jaw tighten, not unpleasantly, but with the specific tension of a man exercising very deliberate restraint, and she felt her own pulse jump and looked at the wall until it steadied. They had not spoken directly about what the stone meant in terms of the two of them. They had circled around it, the way you circle around a fire that gives both light and heat, and which requires respect. It was there between them constantly, the unspoken fact of it, warm and alive and patient. It was Vivien who forced the conversation, as Vivien had a way of forcing things that should have unfolded naturally into damage. She had been watching. Sarah had known she was watching, had tracked the quality of her cousin's attention like a barometer tracking weather, noting the way it moved from superficial warmth to speculative calculation, to something colder and more purposeful as the days passed, and it became clear that Caden was not treating Sarah as a political curiosity, but as a person he intended to keep near him. Vivien had allies in the pack, women who had been competing for the king's attention, and had lost not to a rival, but to a revelation, and alliances built on shared resentment had a specific, dangerous kind of energy. Sarah was in the kitchen because she found the kitchen soothing, and had taken to returning to it in the late afternoons, the way some people return to childhood rooms for comfort, when she heard the voices in the corridor outside. Not arguing. Worse than arguing. The low, deliberate, perfectly modulated tones of someone delivering information that has been designed as a weapon. She is not what she appears to be. That was Vivien's voice, smooth and certain. The mark, the light, all of it. I have been asking questions. There are those who believe it was manufactured, who believe she sought this out, that she or those working with her staged the entire ceremony. A pause. A woman who cannot shift, cannot function as a proper wolf, with no pack standing, no history, no lineage that anyone can verify, and yet she lights up the most sacred stone in the territory? You have been in this world long enough to know when something is being performed. Another pause. Longer. I only say this because I respect you, and because I would hate for you to be made a fool. Silence. Then Caden's voice. Are you finished? Sarah stood very still in the kitchen, her hands flat on the work table, not breathing. I asked, Caden said, with a quietness that was not calm so much as a specific kind of extremely controlled force. If you are finished. Because I want to be certain you have said everything you intended to say before I respond. I find it is better to let people finish. Vivien's voice, slightly less steady. I simply wanted you to consider the possibility that you are being manipulated. I have considered it, Caden said. I consider it as a matter of course. It is part of my function to evaluate the possibility of manipulation in every situation I encounter, and I am reasonably competent at it. The stone is 400 years old. It does not have a political agenda. The first blood mark cannot be faked. It has not been seen in 4 centuries, and every elder in this territory is in agreement about what they witnessed. What you are doing right now is telling me that the woman who lights up ancient artifacts and carries a bloodline we all believed extinct is somehow not worth my attention. I want you to think about whether that logic holds. A pause that had weight. It does not. Another pause. I am going to ask you, out of respect for your pax, hospitality, not to have this particular conversation with anyone else. We understand each other. She heard Vivien's footsteps retreat. She heard nothing from the corridor for a moment. Then she heard the kitchen door open, and she did not look up from the work table, and she heard Caden come in and stand a few feet behind her, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. How much of that did you hear? He said. Not a question. He knew. Enough, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud. Of that. She is afraid of you, he said. People who are afraid tend to attack the thing they fear and call it strategy. She turned around and looked at him. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, and the late afternoon light from the kitchen window was doing something to the angles of his face that she was trying not to pay too much attention to. You do not have to defend me, she said. I have been handling Vivien since before you knew I existed. I know that, he said. I was not defending you. I was expressing my own opinion of the situation. There is a difference. He looked at her with those direct, unguarded eyes that she was increasingly unable to treat as anything other than a version of the stone's light, illuminating things she had kept in the dark. You are competent at surviving things, he continued. I have noticed that about you. You have spent a long time being competent at surviving. I am beginning to wonder if anyone has ever offered you the alternative. The alternative to surviving? She said. Thriving, he said simply. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the doorframe. It is different. She felt the warmth in her hands pulse so strongly she had to press them flat against the work table behind her. He saw it, the motion, and his eyes moved from her hands to her face, and something shifted in his expression that had nothing of the controlled king in it, something raw and certain and undisguised. She felt it land in her chest. Like a key turning in a lock she had not known she had. He took one step toward her, and then his watch vibrated on his wrist, and he stopped and looked at it, and the moment folded itself away like a letter being put back into an envelope, present but no longer legible. He looked up at her, and there was something that might have been rueful in his expression, the most human expression she had yet seen on him. Council meeting, he said. Of course, she said. He walked to the kitchen door and then stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her over his shoulder. Sarah, he said, the conversation is not over. She turned back to the work table and pressed her knuckles against her mouth and let herself feel, very quietly and very privately, the full warm weight of that. The attack happened 3 days later. She had been expecting something, in the abstract way you expect something when you have watched someone like Vivien recalculate and grow still with the particular stillness of a predator settling into a different strategy. What she had not expected was its specific form, which was not a social attack or a political maneuver, but something more direct, more desperate, more revealing of how frightened Vivien actually was. Sarah was walking back to the main house from the temple after an early morning session with Marin when 2 large wolves appeared from the tree line to her left. Not pack wolves. Their scent was wrong, foreign, carrying the marker of a different territory entirely. They were paid, she understood instantly, with the new clarity of perception that Marin had been patiently cultivating in her. She could feel the mercenary quality of their intent, the contracted coldness of it. No personal animus, but the focused purpose of a job. She had approximately 4 seconds between this understanding and the first wolf's approach. She had no weapon. She had no shifted wolf. She had the warm pulse in her hands and 23 years of being. Underestimated, and in that 4-second window she stopped being afraid and became something else, something that had been building in her since the stone blazed and had been building faster since every morning session with Marin, something that the first bloodline in her blood recognized as its own natural function. She faced the wolves. She did not run. She let the warmth in her hands climb up her arms, and she looked at the approaching wolf, directly, the way Marin had taught her, not at the Sioux. Surface aggression, but through it, to the animal underneath, and she spoke. Not in words, in something older than words, a resonance, a recognition, a vibration at the frequency of the wolf's own deepest nature. And she said, in that soundless language, "I see you. I know what you are. You do not want this." The wolf stopped. It stopped so completely and so suddenly that it lost its footing slightly, scrambling to maintain balance, and it looked at her with yellow eyes gone wide and confused, and underneath the confusion, something that was almost relief. The second wolf stopped too. They looked at each other, and then at her, and she felt the calculation in them change, the contracted purpose dissolving as something older and more fundamental asserted itself, and then they turned and ran back into the tree line, and were gone. She stood in the empty path with her heart slamming and her hands blazing white, and realized that she had just done something that was not survivable without a wolf, was not possible for a half-born girl from a storage room, was not available to anyone without the specific ancient authority of the blood she had been carrying, unknowing, her entire life. She had not survived the threat. She had ended it. Caden found her on the path 30 seconds later, which suggested he had been closer than her usual escort, which suggested he had anticipated something, which she filed away. He took in the white light still visible on her hands, and the wolf tracks in, the soft earth at the tree line, and her expression, and he crossed to her without running, but without taking his time either, and he put both hands on her face, and looked at her with an intensity that she could feel against her skin like heat. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He kept his hands where they were, cupping her face, his thumbs against her cheekbones, and he looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of his attention, and something in it that was not calculated or controlled or diplomatically calibrated, something that was simply the man underneath all of those things, undisguised and direct. "I heard you," he said quietly. "The resonance. I felt it from 30 meters away. I felt it the way you feel a sound that is below what you can hear, but still moves through your chest." She looked up at him. "Were you following me?" she said. "Yes," he said, without apology or elaborate explanation. "I was following you. I have been following you at a distance every morning since the night of the ceremony. I did not tell you because I suspected you would object, and I was not willing to stop." He paused. "Are you objecting now?" She thought about it. She looked at his face, still close to hers, his hands still warm against her skin. She thought about the word thriving. She thought about the kitchen door frame and the key in the lock. She thought about the girl who had learned to make herself invisible, and the woman who had just stood on a forest path and made 2 mercenary wolves turn and run by, speaking to them in a language older than fear. "No," she said. "I am not objecting." Something in his face changed. She felt the mate bond between them, properly felt it for the first time. Not as an abstract concept or a historical fact, but as a physical truth. A resonance between them that had been building since the stone, and was now present and acknowledged and undeniable. Warm and certain and vast, and she felt her wolf stir in response to it, deeper than she had ever felt it, pressing upward through years of suppression with a slow and irresistible force. He lowered his hands from her face and took one of her blazing hands in his, and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the warmth between their palms was the warmth of something long awaited finally arriving. In the days between the attack on the path and the investigation's conclusion, Sarah found herself in a strange and disorienting position, which was the position of someone who is accustomed to being peripheral, suddenly finding themselves central. The pack treated her differently now. It was not uniformly warm, which she had not expected, and she would have been suspicious of uniform warmth if it had appeared, because she had lived in this pack long enough to know that its social currents ran deep and complicated and did not reverse overnight. But there was a quality of attention in the way people looked at her that had not been there before, a recalibration, as if they were not simply reassessing her standing, but reassessing their own assumptions about who had standing and why, and what they had been measuring all along. Old Morris, the head cook, shook her hand one morning in the kitchen with the formality of a man presenting credentials, and told her that he had always known there was something unusual about her instincts with food, and Sarah understood that he meant it as a genuine offering, an acknowledgement given in the language available to him, and she accepted it in the same spirit. Pack children who had previously looked through her with the casual invisibility that children learn from their parents began stopping to look at her with undisguised curiosity, the uncomplicated fascination of young people encountering something genuinely new. She found this easier than the adult version. Children did not have the complicated layer of prior social calculation sitting between them and their reactions. They simply looked. She was beginning to understand the value of being looked at. Caden continued his campaign of deliberate and increasingly undisguised attention. She had started to think of it that way, as a campaign, because it had the consistent strategic quality of a man who had identified a goal and was applying himself to it with the same focused intelligence he presumably applied to governing 7 territories. He found her in the kitchen, and in the temple, and in the quiet corner of the garden, where she sometimes went to think, and he sat with her in each of these places with the comfortable ease of a man who had decided that her locations were by definition worth inhabiting. He asked her, over several mornings, to tell him about her life, not the broad strokes that the pack records would show, but the actual texture of it, the things she had done and thought and felt and wanted. He was a good listener. She had not expected that. She had constructed, before knowing him, a model of what a man like him would be, powerful and decisive and accustomed to the kind of conversation that moved quickly between important points. Conversation as transaction. He was not that. He was patient in a way that felt chosen rather than natural, as if he had cultivated patience specifically for the situations that mattered to him. And she was, apparently, a situation that mattered to him. And the understanding of this continued to reorganize something fundamental in how she moved through the world. She told him about the kitchen, about the years of making herself useful through food when usefulness through status was not available to her. She told him about the storage room and the cedar smell. She told him about watching the last claiming ceremony from the hillside at 12, and the specific quality of that exclusion, the way it had taught her to locate herself outside the circle of things that mattered, rather than inside them. He listened to all of it without the discomfort that people sometimes showed when confronted with the evidence of how others had been treated, the social instinct to look away from something painful. He looked at it directly. He asked precise questions. He did not offer pity, for which she was grateful, because pity was another way of locating someone outside the circle, making them the object of a feeling rather than its subject. What he offered instead was something more like witness, the specific quality of being truly seen in one's own history, rather than being summarized by it, and she thought it might be the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her. She did not tell him she was falling in love with him. She was 23, and had never trusted anything this significant, and she needed to be certain it was real, and not a response to the extraordinary circumstances, not the mate bond creating feelings that she was mistaking for choice, not the shock of being seen making her reach for the first pair of eyes that treated her as worth seeing. She needed the feeling to survive the ordinary days, the days without crisis or revelation, the quiet mornings and the long evenings, and she needed to observe whether it survived those and continued to be true. It did. Every morning and every evening it continued to be true. The question of Vivien was resolved not by Caden, but by the investigation that Marin had been conducting quietly in the background, with the patient thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting 40 years for the truth to be findable. It took another 2 days. The evidence she uncovered was specific and devastating. Correspondence between Vivien's father, now dead, and the men who had arranged the accident that was not an accident. And beneath that, deeper correspondence with parties outside the pack who had known about the first bloodline and had spent 2 decades ensuring its most recent inheritor remained suppressed, remained half-born, remained invisible. The mercenaries on the path had been hired at Vivien's direction, using funds from those same outside parties. When Alpha Gregor was presented with the evidence, he had the expression of a man who had known, on some level, that something in his house was rotten, and had chosen not to look, and was now being made to see it directly. He handled it with more decisiveness than Sarah had expected from him, which perhaps was the difference between a man choosing not to see and a man confronted with a crime that had nearly killed someone on his territory in front of a king. Vivien was brought before the full pack assembly in the Great Hall, the same hall where the claiming ceremony banners still hung in their crimson and iron, and the evidence was laid out with the methodical completeness of a woman who had been thorough. Vivien stood with her chin lifted and her face composed in an expression of aristocratic outrage that did not crack until the 3rd piece of correspondence was read aloud. And then it cracked. Precisely 1 millimeter. A single betrayal of control that every person in the hall saw because they were all looking very closely. She was stripped of her rank. She was not exiled because the crime was her father's as much as hers, and Gregor was a fair man when directly confronted with the need to be, but she was stripped of rank and removed from pack standing. And the particular quality of the pack's gaze as she walked out of the hall told Sarah that the social consequences would be thorough and lasting in the way that only pack consequences can be. Sarah did not watch her go with the satisfaction she had expected to feel. She felt, instead, something quieter and more complicated. A sadness for the girl Vivien might have been without years of fear and entitlement shaping her into the woman she had become. And underneath the sadness, a release. The specific release of a weight you have carried so long you had stopped noticing its presence until the moment it was lifted. She sat in. The hall after the others had dispersed and breathed the absence of it, and Caden sat beside her without being asked, close enough that their arms touched, and he did not say anything, and she was grateful for that particular wisdom. 3 weeks after the claiming ceremony, Marin told her that the suppression was nearly gone. She could feel it going, in the way you feel a fever breaking, that shift from compressed and locked to something opening outward, the wolf in her rising by degrees with a certainty that was no longer frightening but simply true. She still had not shifted, but she could feel the moment coming the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue, present and imminent. She was in the temple the morning it happened, alone, sitting with her hands on the claiming stone, and feeling its resonance move through her like a tide, when the wolf that had been sleeping for 23 years rose up all at once and shifted her form with a sureness and a grace that bore no resemblance to the painful, effortful first shifts she had heard described. She was on 4 legs for approximately 40 seconds before she shifted back, kneeling on the temple floor with her hands against the stone and her chest heaving and tears running down her face that were not sadness, but the overwhelming relief of a body finally becoming what it had always been meant to be. Caden was in the doorway when she turned around. She did not know how long he had been there. His face had an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when something moved him that he had not given himself permission to be moved by. A compression around his eyes and a stillness in his jaw that was less the controlled blankness of the king and more the active restraint of the man. He crossed the temple and went down on one knee in front of her, which was not how he moved, which was not a thing she had seen him do before, and he took her hands in his, the hands that had been blazing with the first bloodlight, and he looked at her with everything present in his face, unguarded and certain. "I have been looking," he said, "for a very long time, for the bloodline, for the mate bond, for someone worth kneeling in front of." He paused. "I did not expect to find her in a kitchen." She laughed. and the laugh came out wet and raw and completely real. "I did not expect to be found," she said. "By anyone. For anything." "I know," he said. "I know. And I am sorry for every year
You were not."
His grip on her hands tightened. "I want to offer you something. Not the political arrangement. Not the first blood significance. Not the mate bond as obligation. I want to offer you the choice that was taken from you. To stand in your own power. To be seen. To be chosen. Not by a stone, or an ancient bloodline, or a political calculation, but by me. As a man. Because you are extraordinary, Sarah Voss. And you have been extraordinary your entire life, and the world was simply too small-minded to notice." He held her gaze. "What do you say?" She looked at him on his knee in front of her. This man who was the most powerful figure in the known world, and who had spent 3 weeks asking her questions, and listening to her answers, and following her at a discreet distance through the early morning trees, and standing up in public to defend her clarity and her worth. She thought about the small storage room and the kitchen, and the ceremonies she had watched from hillsides. She thought about the word invisible, and the word thriving, and the distance between them. She felt the warmth in her hands travel up her arms and settle in her chest like a homecoming. She felt her wolf, awake and certain and deeply, resoundingly at peace. "Yes," she said. And the word, simple as it was, felt like the whole beginning of a different story. The formal recognition ceremony was held 1 month later, in the capital, at the Iron Throne's Great Hall, before a gathered audience of pack leaders and nobles and political delegates from every territory in the known world who had traveled to witness the presentation of the first blood heir and the announcement of the king's chosen mate. Sarah stood in a gown the color of midnight silver, a color that Caden had selected by the specific and somewhat startling method of standing in the dress shop for 40 minutes, eliminating everything that was not right with a precision that made the dressmaker blink in professional respect. And she stood without the hunched, self-diminishing posture she had spent years perfecting, because there was no reason for it anymore, because she had spent a month with Marin, and with herself, and with a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time. And the posture of a woman who is trying to be invisible is structurally incompatible with the posture of a woman who has no reason to be. She stood straight. She stood in the light. She felt the first. Blood warmth in her hands as a background hum, steady and warm, like the sound of her own heartbeat, like the presence of her own wolf, like the feeling of all the things she was finally allowed to be. Caden took her hand when she reached the throne, and the gesture was not performed, and was not ceremonial, and was simply the hand of a man reaching for the hand of a woman he had chosen. And the mate bond between them sang at the contact with the warmth of two things that have been moving toward each other across a great deal of time and distance, finally arriving in the same place. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them looked away. "Are you ready?" he said quietly, for her alone. She thought about the girl who had learned to be invisible. She thought about the woman who had stood on a forest path and made predators turn and run. She thought about the stone blazing, and her wolf rising, and the small cedar-smelling room that was very far away and very long ago. She felt the warmth pulse through her hands and her chest, and the full length of her spine. And she looked at King Caden of the Iron Throne, the man who had knelt on a temple floor and asked for her choice, and she smiled at him with everything she had. "I have been ready," she said, "for much longer than either of us knew." He smiled back. The full version, unguarded and warm and entirely unlike anything the assembled delegates had ever seen from the Iron King, and there was an audible shift in the gathered crowd, a collective inhale at the sight of it, because some things are unmistakable. He turned to face the hall, and she turned with him, and when he raised her hand and addressed the assembled world, his voice carried with the full authority of his office, and the full sincerity of a man who has found what he was looking for, and is not interested in understating it. I present to you, he said, Sarah Voss, first blood heir of the original Alpha line. My mate. Your queen. The hall erupted. The sound of it moved through her chest like the stone's light had, like her wolf's first shift had, like Caden's hands on her face had, like the word thriving had the first time she heard it and understood, on some cellular level, that it meant something she was allowed to want. She stood in the eruption of sound and the blaze of light and the warmth of a bond that was ancient and chosen and entirely, finally hers, and she did not look for the corner of the room. She had no need of corners. She stood in the center of everything, straight-spined and warm-handed and completely, fully present, and she let herself be seen. She let herself be seen. The girl who had been invisible stood in front of the world and blazed, and the world looked back, and all of it was real, all of it was true, and all of it was only the beginning. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?